All right. Welcome, welcome. People are pouring in. This is great.
I have the right nick promoted to panelist, yes.
Yeah, don't want to make that mistake. We don't want the wrong nick in here. Awesome. All right, we're just gonna hold off for a couple of minutes as people sign on here. I hope you're enjoying our beautiful thunderstorm. Our panelists were just talking about how we might be able to use it to add some fun effects to today's presentation. The format for today is webinar based, so we will have only our presenters here on the screen for the first part. Though we will be creating an opportunity for anyone during the Q&A to pop in and ask their question and interact a little bit more. If you have any questions, or if you'd like to share where you are tuning in from today, that would be super cool. And you can do so via the chat. I'm realizing now that I have not had my video on, so there we go. Now you can see me anyways. Awesome. Got some people coming from Kalogirou.
Oh, there comes the rain.
Yeah, I think it's hailing downtown here.
All right. Well, welcome. In an effort to get things rolling quickly here, welcome. So my name is Warren. I'm going to be your host for tonight. We also have Zvonimir from our team at Amii. We're excited to
Hey, everyone.
To meet with you virtually again. This is our third installment of this monthly AI Meetup, where we've actually hosted virtually. One of my favorite things has been seeing all of the people that might not be able to make it to an in-person session here, in Edmonton, where we typically host this event with our good friends at Startup Edmonton in the Mercer warehouse. So it's a nice space and it's nice to see each other. But we've been seeing people tune in from all over the place. So already there's someone from Morocco here tonight. That's fantastic. Hello and welcome. We had someone tuning in live all the way from Nigeria last month, which was really cool. And so the format for tonight is going to be really fun. We try to keep things pretty informal. Again, this is meant to be a meetup, sharing thoughts, having a chance to ask questions. And so for those who don't know, Amii is the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute. History of decades of great research, excellence, and training here at the University of Alberta has put us in a great position as one of the centers of excellence for machine learning and AI across the world. And wow, someone tuning in from Tokyo. That's fantastic. Welcome. So whether you are a business, a student, or just looking to get more involved in the AI community, Amii has a whole host of great programs and resources to support you, and we would love to connect. So you can reach out to us through amii.ca or drop us a line at hello@amii.ca. We'll share this on screen later on tonight. And so if you haven't been to one of these meetups, here's what you can expect. Share a few housekeeping rules items for tonight. So we're going to try to keep the talks pretty brief. These aren't going to be 90-minute white paper presentations. We want to keep things pretty informal and create more of a chance for an interaction. And bear in mind, if things don't go perfectly, that's intentional. We want to leave room for improvement for next time. We're going to be experimenting with some different formats for some of our upcoming meetups as well, so you can look forward to that. This session is going to be recorded. There's going to be 2 presentations, and we leave 10 minutes at the end of each one for some more interaction. So you're welcome to take advantage of the Q&A function throughout if you want to capture a question there. Please do, or feel free to hold on to that, and at the very end, we can add you as a panelist, and you can show up on screen and ask that question in more of a face-to-face way. You'll be receiving a quick prompt tomorrow where you can provide some thoughts and feedback for us. Please do. That helps us to make these community events better and better, and to pass along feedback to our fantastic speakers as well. There was a question I just saw on the chat about how the recording will be distributed, which is a great question. We'll be actually reviewing the presentation with our speakers and then posting the content on Amii's YouTube channel. So that will be distributed and really easy for you to find afterwards. One of the things that is missing in the virtual format is a chance to have follow-up conversations, the typical banter and carrying on that tends to happen after our meetups in person. So we really like, actually on Thursdays, our good friends at Startup TNT host a virtual happy hour via Discord. So I'm going to share the link to that. And if anyone's interested in carrying on afterwards, please take advantage of that channel. There's lots of different leaders from across the Edmonton tech community that come out for that every week. And if you're interested, check out startuptnt.com. They'll even send you a free kombucha or craft beer for participating at future events. So it's a nice way to kind of plug in and meet people. But without further ado, we're going to jump right into our first presentation from Nick, who's joining us from G2V Optics. So welcome, Nick, and please take it away.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Warren. Let me share my screen. Okay, here we go. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Nick, and over the last few years, I've transitioned my career into data science from engineering. And I've recently had some time between some jobs to do a scan of the field of AI ethics. And this presentation is the result. I want to share with you a quote about technology that I often think about, and that I saw this in a Nature documentary. The real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. It's pretty absurd to think that we're apes who somehow have developed this tool of artificial intelligence, yet we haven't developed as much our emotions and our institutions to responsibly wield that technology. To me, the quote really highlights the need to continuously develop ourselves in order to take advantage of the incredible opportunity of AI, but also to manage the equally incredible threats that AI may pose to both humanity and the Earth. We're still in the infancy of developing ethical approaches to the wise integration of AI in this world. In my day job, I'm a product developer and data scientist for G2V Optics. And the basic premise of my job is manipulating light environment conditions and modeling plant health data to reduce stress and encourage well-being for indoor growing of plants. And I find myself often thinking, what are the conditions of well-being for humans in this world? What can we design the systems to live sustainably here on Earth? How do we design for human thriving in those systems? So that to me leads directly to thinking about how do we build responsible AI models. In this presentation, I'm going to try briefly answer this question of like, why does AI ethics matter? And why it's important, why we should care, and especially during this time of upheaval that humanity finds itself in. So we're gonna go through what we mean by AI ethics. Then I'm going to introduce a nested systems model to help us explore. We're gonna go through the what, the who, the themes, the gaps of AI ethics right now. And finally, what can we do as data practitioners? So, what are we talking about? I've been a professional engineer for the last 8 years, and my first exposure to ethics was a seminar held at the end of my engineering degree by the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Alberta, APEGA. And here's their first rule of conduct for engineers in Alberta. So in their area of practice, engineers shall hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public and have regard for the environment. Professions throughout history have developed ethical codes which help practitioners reason through the impact of their practice on people and environments. Just consider like the tens of thousands of people killed or injured from steam engines and boilers in the 19th century, right here in North America and Alberta, before professional bodies existed in engineering. The Alberta Boiler Safety Association, which still exists today, passed some regulation on unsafe practices in 1897, which saved countless amounts of lives over the next century. Regulation was positive for both the profession and the public. The public were able to trust engineers more. And as a result, the regulation, the public had a safer relationship with technology. Engineering ethics certainly are not perfect, but at least we have some guidelines and consequences for our behavior. AI is like engineering in the 19th century. AI doesn't have a professional body or an ethical code yet. And as data scientists, we don't see ourselves yet as professionals with larger responsibilities to AI in society. There is a growing recognition that there's data in every part of our lives and that it's at a massive scale and that we need to develop our reasoning both of like the harms and the benefits of AI algorithms. Now I'm going to move on to quickly just like what is ethics. So a central question of ethics is how do you know you're doing more good than harm? And so the definition we're going to use today is that ethics is the ongoing study, development, and application of moral reasoning. And, you know, morals can change over time, but ethics is like that wrapper layer around it. It's a critical, disciplined questioning of what's right and wrong, like what's harm and what's benefit. And just a quick word on AI. So there's two big categories of AI. There's artificial general intelligence and artificial narrow intelligence. So the general intelligence is questions of sentience and consciousness. This is like the Westworld kind of stuff. But there are really long-term implications, and it's like really important questions to answer in that field. But today's talk is just going to focus on artificial narrow intelligence, which is more just intelligence in a very specific area, specific application. And I'm going to interchangeably use the words data science, AI, and artificial narrow intelligence. The focus is on narrow intelligence because data science creates both benefits and harms in the world right now. A big challenge of ethics is having to reason on lots of different levels. So I built a little diagram here to help us explore. We start with some toy version of reality. So our models help us understand and predict something about reality. But that model is given its context, its data, its life in a sense, usually by the modeler, who is typically the data scientist. However, in turn, the modeler gets their context and their information about what is important from the organization. And this could be like a community or a corporation or an institution. Just an example here. Last summer, I encountered a bit of a dilemma myself, where I was following a customer analytics engagement lead for a casino here in Alberta. And the question was, what information can we collect and analyze on casino goers in order to market to them more so they spend more time and money at the casino? Initially, my reasoning kind of went like this. So as the modeler, a benefit could be that I could get paid. I could increase my machine learning experience, another client. The organization could profit. They could have a competitive advantage, digital transformation. But like on the other side, there's possible harms, right? Like what other engagements do I not work on if I work on this one? For the organization, what if there's project failure? What if there's an overrun on costs? There could be brand damage as a result of the model. And so like, as I was thinking about it more, I asked myself, like, what if I really built a model that performed reasonably well? How would people be affected by achieving the goal of like keeping people spending money at the casino? And the answer to that really lies outside of the organization. The organization relies on people, on society coming through their doors, customers who live and interact with societal systems. The casino sets most of its objectives with respect to the economic system, which is just one part of societal systems. So I could see benefits from like an entertainment perspective for some people. We could see potential tax revenue increases because of increased activity at the casino. But on the flip side, what troubled me was a potential increase of addiction to gambling, especially in vulnerable populations, and potentially making it harder for people to escape that place. You know, in my own family history, I've seen the negative effects of gambling and addictions to gambling on class mobility. And it worried me, like, you know, if my algorithm actually was effective, how might it be trapping people in that place? So societal system questions are not just about economic systems, but about stuff like population health, education, justice, these sorts of things. And the casino engagement is just an example of how we can look beyond our immediate circumstances and reason at different levels. At different levels, we can go one further, right? Societies depend on the planet's like natural and life systems, which ultimately is situated within a cosmic system. And if any of those larger systems break down, societies break down as well. And so the concerning impact of models at the natural level, at the larger levels, often have to do with accelerating existing problem areas. So here's just like another example. So last summer, my startup was working on a proposal for a metals refining AI process. So the benefits to the customer being like you can conserve the waste, conserve energy, reduce your CO2 emissions as a result of implementing this model. However, if the largest level of thinking is the business model, there's a very real danger that as a result of the efficiency gains, the model may encourage us just to use more resources for the same effort actually adding to the climate change problem instead of aiding it. So we're in a constant process of deciding what information from the higher levels do we integrate into the lower levels of our thinking. Ethics would be really quite easy if we didn't care about how others suffer. If we only cared about our own benefits without considering the waste and the suffering and injustice outside of ourselves, then ethics becomes irrelevant because our limited frame says, well, there are no harms. So the marker of our ethical progress is how are we able to reason and care at progressively larger levels? It's an ongoing journey because you can literally never hit the end. But it's just a note that we can always care more. You know, ethics isn't just about looking outside of ourselves, though. It is also uncomfortably, it can hold a mirror back at ourselves. So for example, our economic models. For the most part, we exclude the environment and environmental damage from our economic models, and we consider it an externality. What does that say about our level of caring? What does that say about our identity and our accepted values, if that is the case? Our many identities shape our morality. Like if you see yourself as isolated, you may pursue your own happiness at the expense of others. If you identify with your community, your values probably will emphasize like the welfare of the group. If you identify with nature, you'll probably feel drawn to nurture and protect the natural world. And having the courage to question our own identities and our own values is critical if we're going to start caring at larger and larger levels. So just to sum up that section, ethics is really this work of both looking inwards, but also looking outwards into the systems that we're embedded in. Now that we've reviewed some different levels of ethics, and I'm just going to go into a really broad overview of like who's working on AI ethics and what are they doing. So we've got individuals like data practitioners, technologists, academics, very much like the people here. They work in various organizations like corporations and nonprofits, academic institutions, governments, and they're trying to do this ethical work. And like, what is that work? It's guidelines, it's interdisciplinary research. Technical tools is a very popular one, laws and regulations, audits of models, and deployment as well. Let's just take, for example, the technical tools. You may have heard of XAI or explainable AI. XAI is a suite of technical tools which allow us to statistically investigate fairness and bias inside of our models. This is the area probably with the most development going on of all of these examples. There's also work that our governments are doing, figuring out the regulation for data and for algorithms and things like data privacy laws. So like, for example, the California Consumer Privacy Act or the more well-known General Data Protection Regulation out of the EU. There's nonprofit groups as well, like AI Now and their yearly report on ethical AI, or the Center for Humane Technology out of the US and their podcast, Your Undivided Attention. They provide things like critical discourse, resources, and policy recommendations for responsible AI algorithms. And if you're interested in more of these examples, I encourage you to look at my reference section and examples on my website later. So, what are the themes of this ethics work? There's easily like 50 to 100 guidelines and frameworks out there that someone has free access to already. So I wanted to share with you a sense of like, what are the themes that they explore and what are the people discussing? So this is a list of kind of like the top themes in a recent literature review of many guidelines in 2018. And over 80% of the guidelines reference the top three categories here. So accountability, privacy, and fairness. And there's just like an interesting observation here that these top three categories are aspects for which technical fixes can be most readily applied. So there's significant technical efforts going into accountability, explainable AI, privacy, and tooling to determine if your models are fair or discriminatory. This literature review I read also noted, though, the themes of what are we not talking about. And being such early days with ethics and AI, we are bound to see significant gaps in our ethical conduct. So here are the major ones. The first is seeing ethical AI as a technical problem. This is the most popular approach to ethical AI right now. However, ethics in AI is never just a technical problem. Really big challenges are usually social technical problems or environment technical problems, like the dynamics between the two. And the solution to these types of problems require collective action. So it heavily involves self-organization, right incentives, and the right public policy. Second, currently violating ethical standards and codes have no consequences. Technology always outpaces the law. And until our laws and regulations catch up, it's up to ourselves to self-police. We don't have professional bodies yet, like medicine and engineering, so we're left to govern ourselves. We also look to vague ethical guidelines and not ourselves for ethical development. There are studies that show that aspirational guidelines have little to no effect on ethical action. We tend to look outside of ourselves instead of developing ourselves within, looking inward. For ethical guidelines and checklists to be effective, they have to be accompanied by caring self-development. And lastly, we tend to skip questioning in the name of profit. So in lots of contexts, cost efficiencies, profit maximization, and speed is everything. For example, take it Facebook's infamous motivating line, move fast and break things. With this motto, it's easy to see how ethical inquiry takes second place to dominating a market, without much care to see what breaks or who gets harmed in the process. Having regular open discussion and critical questioning is really needed before, during, and after the development and deployment of these models. There are, well, these gaps play into some fairly concerning societal consequences of AI that are playing out today. So again, like the big problem with AI is not the AI itself. It's not the math itself, but like the acceleration of existing social challenges. So first, AI is definitely accelerating trends in inequality. So AI is really hard to develop, so it's generally those in power who are funding these efforts, wielding and controlling this technology. And this tends to give them more power when they develop that AI. So it's this concentration of power. And low-wage earners are seeing threats to their job security and wages as a result. And algorithms in our lives are solidifying that gap, that expanding gap between the poor and the rich. Cathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, is like a really fascinating look at this, like the picture of how algorithms change a person's life, mainly in a US context. The second is the loss of liberty. AI is consuming masses of personal data. And in this digital age, like we're digital citizens, and privacy like is liberty. Digital rights like privacy are human rights. And we're just starting to see AI as a tool of government and corporate control through increased surveillance of so many different aspects of our lives. And lastly, the attack on truth, and especially in our online social platforms. We're being pushed into social and political tribes by the AI algorithms managing the information on these platforms. We just get flooded with information and fed with divisive messages. It leaves us questioning what is the truth and who to trust. And without oversight of these models that form all of the information sphere around us, we leave ourselves vulnerable to being exploited by those wanting to manipulate our psychology. And the scary thing is, in the last few years, this has shown us plenty of examples of this happening, how bad faith actors can manipulate AI recommendation systems, especially in online social media. And this has really troubling repercussions for our civil discourse, our politics, and our democracy. Having our algorithms give us the same picture of reality is so important for coming to a shared understanding. It really is like the basis of civil discourse, and it's the basis of navigating these giant challenges of the 21st century. For example, the truth of public health information online, like coronavirus disinformation, which has an alarming reach on social media platforms, can literally be a matter of life and death. Ethics is not some disconnected concept which only academics participate in. So here are some suggestions of what we can do as data practitioners, technologists, individuals. As I was alluding to before, developing ourselves, widening our sense of identity and of caring, and not just your technical skill. We can join communities of other people that promote wider senses of caring. For example, I cannot recommend enough Your Undivided Attention, this podcast by the Center for Humane Technology. They explore technology, ethics, misinformation and disinformation, the decay of truth, and its relations to climate change as well. And it's specifically aimed at AI designers and data scientists. You don't have to limit yourself to the organization or just like your culture's moral code. You can find globally clear stories and examples of positive engagement, which motivate you, as opposed to cynical, bitter disengagement, which often leads just to inaction. We need to talk about it. We need to discuss our values. Otherwise, we're not going to act on it. The least we can do is honestly discuss the levels of impact and jump in with open eyes. We need to be talking about that gap between our values and our actions. And we don't have to stop at business values. We can go beyond the business model, and we can discuss what kind of world we want to see, you know, as a person, as an organization, and as a society. We can use and develop ethical checklists and techniques, helping us ask questions at broader levels. There's so many resources out there for this, and not just asking questions at the beginning and like the design stage of our models, but during development and during deployment and ongoing. And it's really important as well to write down at each of these stages what we're thinking and how it is changing. As we question, we need to include the people who are affected by the models. We got to think about, like, who do we want to empower? Asa Raskin from the Center for Humane Technology has this great line, and he says, "The people closest to the pain should be closest to the power." Lastly, and very importantly, we can be active citizens and take collective action. We need to place public pressure on our corporations and our governments, because the solutions to ethical problems are not just technical in nature. AI ethics really has similarities to other big challenges like racism and climate change. And these problems require us to balance both the individual and the system, the whole, to be effective. Racism won't be tackled effectively if we just look at individual acts of racism. We have to collectively act to place public pressure to change the system of unfairness, not just individual people. Individual actions of reducing our carbon footprint definitely can help, but climate change isn't going to stop accelerating until we look at the system and the entire way we produce energy and change its links to the economy. AI ethics won't progress very well if we just leave it up to data scientists at their own organizations doing the right thing. We need a broad selection of leaders, laws, regulations, and social norms so we can have a level of oversight and control around harmful AI algorithms and hold them accountable. And as data practitioners and technologists, I think that we're in a pretty unique position for that communication with the public policy, public action, professional ethics, and self-organization. A lot of you are probably really familiar with this model. It's the general data analytics lifecycle. There are more and more people thinking, what's the ethical version of this? And here's a good example I found lately of, and it's a project called Dion, and it's a data science ethics checklist with questions and examples. So there's lots of great questions in here through different stages of the analytics lifecycle. So like, how did we source that data? What's the ultimate effect of our model? There's too many to talk about here today, but I just want to pick out two interesting ones. So proxy discrimination. Do we know if the features in our model are proxies for discriminatory variables? So for example, does it make sense to use postal code or zip code in a model? At first glance, it seems pretty reasonable, but it would be also good to know that geographic area is highly correlated with socioeconomic status and race. So we have to ask, is it appropriate to use that variable, as it may by proxy possibly be discriminatory? And fairness across groups. How fair is this model when we apply it across different societal groups? A super current example that you might have heard on the news lately is facial recognition. It turns out that facial recognition, which certainly uses AI models, is significantly worse at identifying people with darker skin. Our models may treat different societal groups differently, to their detriment or even to their arrest. What I found to be really engaging was thinking about how do we come up with a better ethical process. So considering some of those gaps, here's just like a first version of some of my thoughts. And it's just a simple combination of looking at ourselves, looking at our own motivations, and then moving on to things like ethical checklists. So to me, first and foremost, we have to set the moral compass. We have to, with the widest sense of caring and compassion that we can actually muster. A core discipline of caring is compassion. Compassion is the ability to be present with suffering in support of well-being. So how can we be compassionate at ever larger levels? To ourselves, to each other, to our planet. Secondly, we need to be aware of the impacts at broader systems. This is like part 2 where I talk about that nested model. And third, I think that with that level of caring we defined, we have to choose to accept responsibility. It really is a choice to act at the end of the day. And it's a choice that we have to make over and over. I think after we've inquired like this, then we can move on to things like ethical checklists, like Dion to proceed. And around that whole thing is this, what I call like an ethics feedback loop. So we are continually revising and visiting this again and again over time. And you know, testing out models like this, I hope that I can apply some stuff like this within my data science career. And just to conclude, I know there's a lot of people out there who might just be entering the workforce on this call. So my advice is don't give up on your ideals when you enter the workforce. You're gonna feel, I certainly did, a lot of pressure to narrow your focus. But I think with perseverance, we can build towards something larger than ourselves. We can find what we care about and strive towards it. And it's gonna be hard, but I think that's the nature of progress as well. That's what I took away from this exploration myself. I think it's possible to develop our ethics. And to me, it's really encouraging that there are other people on this frontier to help. And I think it all starts with courageous questioning of ourselves and our systems. To build a more ethical world, we have to encourage more people to learn, to try, to think, to act, to do the hard work of ethics for the public, for the environments we live in, and for future generations. Just want to say thanks for listening, everyone. And I couldn't do it without all of these excellent resources and references, in particular, the Human Venture Institute, Kathy O'Neill's book, which I mentioned earlier, and Thilo Hagendorf's literature review. And my contact information is on my website, and you can find this presentation in the presentation notes there as well, and some other resources there. But that's it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nick. This is great. We're about to jump into the Q&A session here. So please, if you have any questions for Nick, let us know. And also just a note that one of the things that I love most about our AI community here is something that was really set off culture-wise by our Amii fellows in the early days of the research group forming here, which is not being afraid to have hard conversations around ethics and AI is something that's really been ingrained into our core values here at Amii. And so something that I think we'll likely see some spirited debate in the Q&A section. In particular, if we have any of our fellows that are joining us tonight, I'm excited to see how this goes. So, all right. So, I guess question number one here. I'm just reading this off. So, a holistic view of a system is the base of a more realistic model than a modeler should apply, as you explained. Do you think creating an AI international manifesto would solve or control the personal ethics problem of a random user or bad people or state? Could that damage the broader AI world? This is coming from Ricardo.
Cool, yeah. I think in general, I think it definitely is kind of like the UN Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It is an aspirational statement, and it's something for us to orient towards. And I think international cooperation at this level for these giant challenges that we're grappling with, it's super, super important for us to internationally cooperate. So I think it's really important for cross-country communication, and yes, for us to come up with some sort of international manifesto. But again, that's like the looking upward thing. We also have to do it ourselves. We can't just look to somebody else should hand down the rules to me, And then it's like we have to develop every day, kind of like in our practices, the ability to develop ourselves as well. So I think you have to do both things.
Great. And we have a couple of questions coming in from Mark Smith in the chat here. So Mark says, Nick, your ethics on decisions of what models you want to build is different than some of the current narratives that we see. Are we breaking the law? Are we acting in the ethics of a Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Are we imposing bias in the model or from the underlying data? What happens, this is a big question, what happens when AI becomes general and super intelligent? So maybe you want to break that down a little.
Sure, yeah, I got the chat window up here so I can answer them. So first, are we breaking the law? So in my opinion, we don't actually have strong regulation and strong laws or strong professional bodies yet. So as I mentioned, there aren't really a lot of consequences yet. Until something really breaks, that's when we see the consequence, and you see kind of like this backlash against companies who haven't, fully thought through the impacts on society. So a lot of the times we're not breaking the law because the technology always outpaces the law. So we see a lot of examples of people kind of testing what the boundaries are of that all the time. And this is why we need these discussions to kind of like come together on what should those laws be and what should the punishments be when we break the law. And are we acting in the ethics of the Charter of Freedom and Rights? I'm not entirely sure about that. I mean, I think that we need to add on to the Charter of Freedoms and Rights. There's certain things that are happening with the ethics of AI, which, when the Charter of Freedoms Rights was developed, it was not considering kind of like this scaled impact of technology. So I think it needs perhaps some updating where we can come to some level of agreement what that update should look like. And we're definitely imposing bias like all the time from like our models. So yes, the underlying data is like, and this is the whole reason for ethics checklists and guidelines is like, because people are realizing we can't just look at this from this very narrow data perspective. We actually should look at it from like an ethical perspective as well. And what happens, when artificial general intelligence comes around, oh man, that's the discussion for an entire other, the ethics of like how we treat other consciousness is like super important because again, it's like this reflection of who we are and who we want to be. And so I don't know what happens when AGI comes around.
Well, we'll maybe save the general intelligence questions for another talk. Okay, so another one here. So you mentioned that unlike physicians, our profession is not controlled by an order. Do you think that it should be? And if so, how long do you think that will take?
So I definitely think that we should be controlled by a professional body. That really comes from my background as an engineer. And with that example I gave, back in the late 19th century, there were like in the Industrial Revolution, we saw this explosion of technology without the ethics to actually accompany it. And then lots of people were killed, right? We're in the same spot with AI, and I definitely think there's reason for us to hold people accountable because we're trying to avoid some of those societal and natural systems harms that are actually currently happening today. So yeah, I definitely think we should be forming a professional body.
Great. There's a question asking about privacy. So don't some of the privacy legislations provincially, nationally apply to AI data collection? Do you want to maybe expand on some of your thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not an expert in the privacy legislation. I've only taken a brief look at it, but my sense of it was that we've just started opening up this debate around privacy and what data should be considered, what could be considered, and I think that these regulations and legislation like doesn't go far enough. It's like, again, we're right in the infancy. I think we're in the 19th century of AI ethics right now, and our privacy really is our liberty. We spend so much of our time online, and all of that data is being sucked up by governments and by corporations. And there's an infinite amount of innovative ways that people are trying to get at your private data and to manipulate you and to push societies in certain directions. And this is where we need strong action and protections from our governments, and like a change of direction as well, just in general from corporations in the AI industry.
That's great. Okay, so two final quick questions here. One is very quick. So it is, what was the podcast that you recommended?
All right, so yeah, so there's a guy called Tristan Harris, and he and Asa Raskin developed the Center for Humane Technology. And their podcast is called Your Undivided Attention. And it is, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, these podcasts are so much more eloquent than I could ever be like around these topics. And they're laser focused on different issues. I really, really recommend it.
Awesome. And so related, so are you aware of any ethical frameworks that are being applied in different areas of machine learning, for example, legal or medical applications?
So when I did kind of like some of the research of this presentation, I just kept it really, really broad. I didn't actually have time to move into kind of like a lower layer and like look at specific professions and stuff. So no, unfortunately, I'm not aware of what specific frameworks that they're using just yet. Again, that's another presentation, I guess.
So we'll look forward to some more comment on that in the version 0.2 presentation then.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Nick. This has been great. It's always fun to see the questions come in as we start to be a little bit more philosophical about how we're talking about AI and how we're defining these things. So this is great. One quick shameless plug here before we get into our next presentation. So we have our upcoming machine learning technician certificate course. The next cohort is actually coming out this fall, so in September. So this is a great way to combine your expertise with the power of technical machine learning to unleash unlimited opportunities for your future. We have heard nonstop from industry that we need more people who understand how to build and deploy and maintain machine learning tools in industry. So this is one of our ways of helping people like yourselves who might have a background in business analysis or in statistics or in programming to learn about machine learning. And so we are really excited to continue to offer this course. You can apply today for that cohort again in September, and you can find more details at amii.ca. Now, our second talk today is really special because it's also a dream come true for a close friend of ours at Amii, Shems, who is joining us all the way from Toronto. She's been dreaming of presenting at more Amii events and getting back to Edmonton ever since her last visit. So we're just overjoyed to have Shems Saleh from the Vector Institute for our final talk today. So take it away, Shems.
Thanks, Warren. That was all completely true. So I'll be sharing my slides now. Let me know, give me like a quick thumbs up that you see it. Yes, it has 4 pictures of humans. Yeah, okay, awesome. So hi, everybody. My talk will be a tiny bit narrower than Nick's talk for sure, in that it'll focus on one project that I have been working on, and I'm really excited to talk to you about. It's called Clinical Collapse Sheets. It was done with the 4 lovely humans on this slide. So I am the first one. My name is Shems, and with Willie, Lauren, and Tristan. My email is also on the slide. If you want to shoot me a message after, shoot me a question. There will also be time for questions after. Okay, let's see if I can move the slides. I can move the slides, great. This is the somewhat boring slide of quick intro and objectives. Basically, interdisciplinary healthcare and machine learning collaborations tend to be hard. And they tend to lead to a lot of pitfalls because of misunderstandings and unmatched expectations and things like that. So this project tries to help. The objectives of it, I'll talk about what this project is in a second, I promise, but the objective is to be a reference for machine learning and healthcare collaborators, to bridge knowledge and expectations, and also to translate knowledge from experienced machine learning scientists who collaborate with clinicians a lot down to the entire community. Okay, so how do things work now? The way collaborations work these days is at the beginning, and this is general based on my experience, they might work a little differently for people on the call, if there are people on the call who have gone through this before, but basically a doctor and a machine learning scientist would get to chatting and identify a problem. They'd see if the data is there, and they might chat a bit more, and then they'd kind of start talking about REBs and how do you share the data and start working through that. So that's kind of like a very, very high level of how things work right now. But then some of the following things tend to happen. So this is story time, and I've got 5 relatively quick stories for you. One is a group, a scientist and her student who works in machine learning and healthcare. So we've interviewed people across the US and Canada, so these stories represent different institutions across the 2 countries. So on the, a student and his supervisor went to this hospital and identified a problem and started working on the data sharing. And it was maybe 9 months after, and this is also 9 months into the student's PhD. So this was 9 months where the student was really excited to start working, read all of the literature reviews, everything was good to go. That student then got the data, and it turned out that most of the data was on paper. So it turned out that the data was missing. There was a bit that was digital, but most of it was on paper with no real capacity to scan it or to get that information from the data on paper, which was really unfortunate, as you can imagine, for that student who had to now just look for new data, and that was a whole thing. Another one that happened is after an entire year of negotiations between an institute and this other entity that holds public health data. After an entire year and everything was set up, all of the researchers and students went through the training processes and everything. What ended up happening after is it turned out that the environment that the data was living on and couldn't be taken out of didn't have enough compute or any compute to do anything meaningful. Another example is a midnight data dump. So basically, one researcher developed a model. It was doing really, really great on the data. And in the time where there was a silent deployment, where if people don't know, silent deployment is basically, if you develop a model, you want it deployed in the hospital, there's a period where you deploy it, but you don't really start using, so you don't start changing anything based on it, just so you kind of see how it reacts to different things. It's kind of like a testing period. So the model was deployed. Well, the model was on its way to be deployed when it was realized that the infrastructure in the hospital actually only does a data dump at midnight, and there was no infrastructure there that could support getting that data the way the model wants it. So the machine learning model would need that data to be plugged in relatively quickly. So it needs to be more online so that it can predict And in this case, it was an infection risk. But unfortunately, the infrastructure wasn't there. So what ended up happening is the researcher had to actually go through a lot of different departments of that hospital and change the infrastructure and figure out a new infrastructure that can feed the data in so that that model can be implemented. So that model is actually now implemented, which is pretty great. And that, had that been identified earlier, what would have been possible is while the model is being developed and tested and all of these things, in parallel, the infrastructure could have been built. Another one is there was a model that actually made it to deployment, and this model just shows this number on the screen, and beeps every once in a while based on some threshold. And after so it was deployed, they interviewed the nurses maybe a month or so after it was deployed, saying, hey, like, how are you liking this? And the answer was actually, like, nobody looks at this and everybody ignores that alarm. Alarm fatigue is very real in a healthcare context. So there was a bit of a workflow of the clinicians and of the nurses wasn't really considered as much in the initial design, is what happened there. And for the last one, so this project was a project that was trying to predict sepsis. And after developing the entire project, every time it gets tested, there's something weird about it. There's something a bit off on the accuracy. There's no real point into going in details, but basically what the machine learning scientists ended up discovering afterwards is the timestamp on the data is not actually the timestamp of the event, but it is the timestamp of when the nurse or the doctor inputted that data. And that was also, something that made a difference for the model. Okay, so all of these things, there's some of the pitfalls. They're to be expected, I guess, to some extent in interdisciplinary collaborations, but the question that my team and I decided to ask is there a way to help this? So is there a way such that, is there a way such that you can have conversations that try to encompass some of these pitfalls to try to either avoid it or mitigate it later on? And so to the question, can we do better? Or there must be a better way, I guess. The answer is yes, or at least we hope so. Through clinical collab sheets, which is the project that we've been working on. And the project is basically a list of questions that aims to facilitate a meaningful initial conversation between a machine learning professional, between a machine learning scientist and a healthcare professional. And that conversation can be related to problem framing, setting common goals and understanding each other's goals and expectations, potential biases, limitations, other potential sources of challenges in these collaborations. So I will kind of describe a bit more about what the list actually looks like, and then that'll be it. The method that we used once we realized this is once we decided to do this is we wanted to get as many experts' opinions on this to make sure we capture as many stories and we make this we get as much expert knowledge into this list as possible. It can act as a reference for somebody who's been doing this for a while, just to remember all of the different things to touch in an initial conversation, or it can welcome newcomers to the field and give them a resource that can help them navigate these initial collaborations. So if this is like a junior faculty, or if this is a scientist in a company, or whoever is going through this path where they're starting this interdisciplinary healthcare and machine learning collaboration, this kind of hopefully can help facilitate the initial conversation. So we ended up, after this aggregation of questions, we ended up dividing the questions into 8 categories. The categories are project scoping, workflow considerations, defining roles and responsibilities, data access and privacy, data generation process, data composition, storage, system integration and compute structure, and safety and fairness. So what do they look like? For project scoping, this is this is relatively, this is usually a project management, and we also talk to project managers throughout to also try to figure out, for any project, what can we take from PMI, like PMI documents and project management frameworks, and bring it onto this project. So for project scoping, it's things like definition, let's figure out if this is a machine learning problem or not. Can we look at the data? What are the benefits of using this technology? Is this the right technology? Can we measure the goal? What are the project goals? What are the participant goals? Metrics and proxies, like what's kind of, what are you trying to measure? And also baseline. So how are things done right now? What have you tried? Things like that. For workflow considerations, this is really important and really underrated. Although a lot of these are somewhat underrated, I guess. Context is really important, so understanding how will this be used. And this section assumes that this is for a project that's specific to deploying a technology in a hospital. If a project is a research project, the person who's using this resource can just pick and choose what they want to get out of it. What's the prediction time horizon? Are there any unintended consequences when this tool is adopted at scale? What's the minimal viable product? Can we kind of try this quickly and see if it works before we do the full scale thing? And does the model need to be retrained at any point? Roles and responsibilities is pretty obvious, but this kind of tries to list all of the different people that can be involved. I think it really does take a village if you want to innovate within this space. So it's really important to identify who the right people are. The main framing that we had in our mind was deployment in hospitals, but a lot of these things can apply to different contexts. What are the timelines? So just different expectations around communication across, around timelines, around what support would we get, who's going to maintain the code, user engagement, information tracking. Data access and privacy is the one that usually doesn't get avoided. But this is kind of to encompass a lot of the stuff that gets brought up in that conversation. So what's required? How can the data be accessed by a new team member? Things like that. Timeline expectations, sensitive data, will it be there? Can we de-identify? If we find de-identified data, what should we do? Benefits and harms. So this is, like what potentially identifiable fields. So this is, the purpose of all of this is just to get people within that conversation thinking through some of these things, right? And having some of these discussions. And then can we retain, can the machine learning scientist retain this data going forward? Can it be reproduced? Can it be replicated? All that. Data generating process. So these are usually the ones that people tend to focus on to some extent because they're related to the data, but it still has an encompassing list, I hope. So yeah, missing data input. So context gets brought up in the data generation process as well, which would be very different than context in the case of workflow consideration. So how will this data be used versus how was this data generated and collected? Talking about how the labels are defined. So this is basically the journey of the data from when the event happened to when the data gets put in a data set and given to a machine learning scientist. Data shift, curation, confounders, and gotchas. And gotchas are these, we kind of go a bit more into the different examples that we've seen in our conversations in the paper. So things like, oh, the timestamp of when the event happened is actually different than the timestamp that you see because data entry versus event time. Composition, this is the usual, here's what's in the data, where did it come from, is it available? If there are, can we combine the data? all of these things. What's the inclusion exclusion for the cohort, noise and error, how many subjects, and data characteristics. These are just kind of mainly the usual, to some extent at least, conversations. Storage system integration and compute infrastructure talks about where will the data live, will that environment have enough compute, what's required to integrate or deploy in the case of deployment, and then how do we consider replicating this work? And this is the last section. So safety and fairness, which is really, really important, obviously. So things like, are there sensitive variables that are available so that the machine learning scientists can do a bit of analysis on fairness and make sure that there's fair treatment, fair outcome, and do all of these analysis. So this is the second one is algorithmic fairness. So risks of false positives, false negatives, what are the trade-offs, understanding all of these things a lot better. And then the wrong treatment risk is, so when we're designing the model, and a lot of these questions get incorporated, I guess, into the design thinking bit of the model. So should we care more about over-treatment? Because if you over-treat by a bit, it's a really big deal. Or should we care a bit more about under-treatment? What does that look like? What risks are we working with? And how much of a margin does the answer that this model gives has? Bias, so were there any biases? Could there be any biases? Hidden stratifications. This is us trying to condense an entire paper by Harini Suresh into a question. I think this is it. It's either, yeah. So are there rare high-risk subpopulations in the data set which need special care or are excluded entirely from the data set? And then the last one is there a mechanism for reproducing the result of this specific work in order to answer some questions? And then is there a defined procedure for validating replicability across different sites? So if you want to deploy it in one place and take it into other places. And yeah, that's it. Thank you. And I'm ready for questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Shems. I am very much enjoying your question slide here as well. So who has questions? Feel free to hit those in the Q&A box, or if you'd like to raise your hand and join us on screen, you're more than welcome to do that as well. If you have any questions for Shems. All right. There we go. Oh, I had someone slide into the DMs here. Okay, so Shems, do you have any additional example projects to share on the type of machine learning applications that you've had a chance to work on?
That I've had a chance to work on, I don't. I have more stories from people around that we've talked to about this. Sepsis tends to be a really popular one. I've already kind of talked about it. Let me think. There's one example actually out of my master's lab, Dr. Anna Goldenberg's lab, where it's an alarm system that triggers one alarm to predict a heart attack within 10 minutes of the heart attack is what it was. So that's another example. Another example, I'm most familiar with my own lab's work, so this is kind of what we're gonna focus on, I guess. Another example is there was a project that tried to predict if a child should go through thyroid surgery, so thyroid removal surgery, and the current model that the doctor was using, or the current decision tree, ended up in more children who were basically false positives. So what that meant is they'd have to go through a surgery, and this is a child at the age of, like less than a year sometimes, or like 1 to 3 years. I don't remember these numbers, so don't hold me to them, but I think it was around that range. And they'd have to go through a surgery for no real reason, I guess, or because it would be a false positive. So that project was trying to find a better method to figure out if the child should go through surgery or not. Those are a couple. There's also a fantastic paper by a number of people, one of which is Marzia Qasimi. I don't seem to remember the rest of the authors, that talks about opportunities in healthcare. And it's a fantastic overview of all of the different opportunities that, that are in healthcare that people can work on. Hopefully in an interdisciplinary manner so that they actually end up making an impact.
Yes, hopefully. Okay, another question here. What are the protocols around making sure ethics and privacy related issues with regards to data are adhered to when working on ML applications with tech companies, or sorry, with health companies?
Okay. Can I read that question?
Yes, just
somewhere. Is it in the open?
just came in.
Okay.
Yeah, it's in open, 821.
Okay. Got it. Okay. So what are the protocols around making sure the ethics and privacy related issues with regards to data are adhered to? Do you mean health companies, or do you mean, I guess, like hospitals? It is from an anonymous attendee. Which means I'm just gonna, yeah. I'm gonna assume that you mean hospitals, or I guess I can try to answer it for both. So for hospitals, the way I've seen it, you usually have an REB, and there's usually the person who holds this is the case of also a researcher with a hospital, because that's where my experience at least comes from. So the researcher would have that liability, would take that liability on, and there would be an REB that gets signed at the beginning of this. Sometimes you also go through some training. So you go through like a half-a-day workshop or course on what you should and shouldn't do. And then from that period forward, it depends on what happens. If there's data leakage, the liability is usually on the researcher. That doesn't usually happen. If there's de-identification, you're expected, for any reason that's usually accidental actually, you're expected to contact the clinician that you're working with and let them know immediately and stop working on the data till that's fixed, and that till they do like some kind of audit of it. Yeah, I think that hopefully answers the questions. From an ethics perspective, ethics is a really big word for in my head at least. I think there are a lot of different ways to look at ethics. In the case of healthcare and machine learning, some of it is which problems should be worked on. Some of it is the model being fair? And if the model is being fair, you know, like how do you check if the model is being fair? Do you have enough data to check? Do you have race data, which is a thing that I'm personally very a big advocate of, is in order to make sure that a model is being fair, you need to be able to audit that model, and to audit that model, a race variable is really important. But also if you want to do like personalized medicine, then it tends to, and I think it should be, I've been reading a book, I think it should be ethnicity and not race. But the point is, it's really, really, it's really important if you want to check if your model's fair. So that's another way to look at ethics. Yeah, it's in a conversation usually with the clinician and the hospital that you're working with is how it goes. With health companies, we're trying to figure it out. So I'll let you know.
That's great. So we have a question, I think, from Russ Greiner, who's just popping on here to join us. Welcome. There we go. Russ, you're live.
So first, that was a great presentation, wonderful set of issues, and very familiar because I've dealt with many of the same things in my last few years. One specific question, you talked about the issues of wrong treatment risk that sort of looks at implicitly the cost of false positives versus cost of false negatives. I've found it very difficult to get clinicians or researchers to quantify those costs Do you have ways you can make that happen? Have you been successful at that?
That's a really good question, and I might want to get back to you on that one actually. The only way I've seen is usually you and you obviously know this, you have repeating interactions with clinicians. So you do some tests and some sampling and go like, is this fine? Is this not? But beyond that, I don't know. Maybe I'll get back to you. I'll ask around and see what people have been doing and keep it in mind.
Okay, because maybe I would like to get your answers. So
Of course.
we'll talk later. Thank you very much. Great talk. Oh, are your slides available, by the way?
Absolutely. Sure thing. I will share them. Warren, do I share them with you?
Yeah, we can help with the distribution there. Yeah, if anyone's interested.
Actually, I can send it directly to you, Russ.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Russ, I want to give you a quick shout out. We also did a survey where we kind of got people to say for each question if it's a favorite, if it's unnecessary, or if it's underrated. And Russ is one of the people who very kindly replied to our survey. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
That's great. Awesome. This Q&A and the topics here, these are clearly really relevant things. So it's awesome that we've got different groups thinking about these. One of the questions that we have here is around how, when we talk about some of the stories that you've shared, it's still pretty raw. There should have been more questions asked. So the question here is asking, does that mean that this type of interdisciplinary collaboration is really new from a project management perspective? So business plus machine learning, does that not yet have a standard methodology to follow? Good. I think this is a good question. What do you think, Shems?
That's a fantastic question. Absolutely. It is unfortunately not. No. I think right now, based on my knowledge, and please feel free to correct me if you know any differently, but the number of machine learning algorithms that have been applied are probably less than 20 in North America, based at least on researcher clinician collaborations that I've heard of and known about in the community. So I would say yes. I would also say the other thing is they're starting to pop up in hospitals. And this is my experience based on Canada. So they're starting to pop up in hospitals, which are departments that are specific to deal with data and how do you analyze data and give insights back to clinicians in a meaningful way. But other than that, the main thing that tends to happen is usually researchers and not data scientists focused on developing models for the hospital, but it's usually researchers working with clinicians that push through some of that work. So I would say, yes, new, definitely new territory.
Uncharted territory. Cool. So this is a related question. So talking about working with clinicians, what are some of the challenges you've seen from exploring ML applications with physicians that might not present in other domains?
That's a very good question as well. So I think that might not present in other domains.
This is where this is where we could get a little bit, maybe this is the type of question for the after party, so you can be a little more candid without having to really hate on any of the positions that you.
No, not at all. I think I think what I would say to that is, in healthcare, you're dealing with a human life, so the mistake that you make is affecting a human life, right? And don't get me wrong, like in a lot of other fields, the mistakes that you make will also affect a human life, like law being a very good example of them, but a lot of different fields. In health, it's, like that's very specific about it. There's also a lot of the patient privacy come in, and a lot of the structures of the organizations, and these tend to be unique. So every city has a different structure to the way that healthcare is done in every city is usually different, right? So Ontario has a healthcare system, but the hospitals are still independent and things like that, right? So that tends to, which which translates to like different dynamics and different things. So that's also a bit special, and understanding that right now is a part of it. I see you smiling, Goran. I will stop.
I just think it's such a fantastic, like, diplomatic answer for what is essentially saying bureaucracy is hard. It can be very hard, and is very present in some of these areas, for good reason in many cases.
Yeah.
So I think you did a fantastic job there. Okay, so final question here. You mentioned issues with alarm fatigue for systems that provide feedback in real time. How do such issues with user interaction generally get dealt with? What are strategies for making the findings of the models more easily consumable in their workflow?
Yeah, that's also a very fantastic question. What I would say, a couple of my favorite questions in the collab sheets is, one is, can we go with the person who's inputted the data, and can we kind of like shadow them and take look at a sample, and the other is, can we also do the same, and this could be one trip, for the person who's going to be using the results out of this model, right? And then can we have a lot of discussions with them? And something that's really important to point out here too is that it's not always the clinician. A lot of times it's the nurse who, isn't related to necessarily to this collaboration, but they're very important. They're a very important group to talk to and understand. So I would say just having the conversation with the person who will be getting that alarm and saying, hey, what do you need? What would be helpful? How often do you want it to ding? And when do you want it to ding? And would you like to mute it so that it never dings? Because right. So as long as you're having these conversations, then it's, you start getting at these issues, and you have, it's really important to listen to the people who'll end up using it.
Awesome. Well, this has been fantastic. So just one more time, thanks again to all of our presenters today, and everyone for bringing forward some really stimulating conversation and great questions. I'm really happy to be able to continue to connect through this format virtually. And we hope to see you next time. So we'll be taking a break for August, actually. So please get out there and safely enjoy your summer, especially if you're close to us here in Alberta with our, I think, 17 hours of sunshine that we're seeing nowadays. It's a great time to be outside. And consider joining us in September for our AI and health meetup, topic that we just talked a bit about today. We're teaming up with some really great partners to bring you a lot more great content in the crossover of AI and healthcare. So I'm really excited to see more conversations about that. And to those of you that would like to connect with any of our presenters, and go ahead, Shems, if you have a final word here. It looked like you needed to.
Sorry. I saw a question and I wanted to just mention it. Somebody asked, how can we get access to this? It'll be on archive in a week, in the MLHC conference in a couple of weeks.
Good point.
And archive potentially in a couple of weeks too. I don't know how long, but yeah.
Now this is recorded, so you're accountable now. There we go. That's great. Well, yeah, thanks so much for everyone for tuning in, and have a great night. Thanks so much.
Thank you.